Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone, for joining in today's webinar. My name is Bhaskar Chand, and I'm the past chair of the West Coast section of the Air and Waste Management. We have been putting these webinars together. During the COVID, we used to have these out here at South Coast A&WMA in person, but because of COVID restrictions, all of last year we have done webinars online, and we are happy you could join us. I hope you will find this useful. We request everyone to mute themselves while Richard is presenting, and if you can hold your questions till the end. It's going to be open mic at the end, so you just need to unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can ask questions through the chat bar also. You can enter your questions there. We can, one of us will pick it up and ask Richard your questions. Bernadette Shaheen, who is our current chair of the West Coast section, I'll hand it over to her to do the introduction. Bernadette, go ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. We're excited to have Richard Corey. He's the Executive Officer of California Air Resources Board. Rich has about over 30 years of experience in the air quality and climate change field. And prior to his appointment as Executive Officer, he was a Deputy Executive Officer, the Chief of Stationary Source Division, and he had various management positions. Mr. Corey leads a team of about 1,700 engineers, scientists, technicians, and analysts, and they're responsible for a broad range of programs, including clean air emission standards for motor vehicles and equipment, fuels, climate incentives, and air toxics. Some of the key programs include the zero and near zero emission standards for mobile and off-road sources, low carbon fuel standards, cap and trade regulations, and focused efforts to drive down emissions and exposure in impacted communities throughout the state. His measures include and incentives include reducing emissions from a variety of goods movement sources, including port trucking, transportation, refrigeration units, cargo handling operations, maritime operations, rail-related good movement, and measures to reduce emissions from stationary and portable diesel engines, as well as several strategies to reduce toxic air contaminants. Mr. Corey has an undergraduate degree in environmental toxicology, as well as an MBA from the University of California, Davis. Richard, take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you to the members for the opportunity to speak with you. I was really looking forward to it and look forward to the open discussion as well, which I always learn something from being able to do that. So my goal in the presentation remarks, I want to talk about a little bit about where we've been as an agency and state from an air quality standpoint, some of the progress made, but I also want to talk about the challenges in front of us, and there are many, and how we are pursuing those in partnership with many others. But it's probably useful to touch on a little bit on just the little background on the organization, just context. So CARB was created in 1967 by a law that Governor Ronald Reagan signed and recognized really the very serious air quality issues that South Coast and other areas of the state were having. US EPA followed. Its creation was a few years later in '70, and in the Clean Air Act, which gave CARB, and this is important, unique authority amongst all the states in the country. So unlike the other states, we have authority to establish motor vehicle standards, cars, trucks, things like that. And we use that authority to for the progress that we've made from an air quality standpoint, and really by de facto have established the national standards by virtue of that work. And may be useful for folks to put on mute, just cut the background noise. And the agency has, as you noted, about over 1,700 staff, a board of 16 members. I'll talk about that in a minute. And regulatory and incentive authority. Those are the two key levers that we use as an organization to work with air districts, US EPA, who both have roles, and I'll briefly comment on that, to really take on a significant air quality challenge, both to achieve healthy air quality, NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, as well as make progress on climate. And in terms of authority, if you think about CARB relative to US EPA, relative to local air districts, you kind of think about EPA as having a role on preempted sources that cross state boundaries, for instance. Think about planes, locomotives, marine vessels. In CARB having authority over cars, trucks, basically we certify, if it burns fuel, we certify it to achieve emission standards. And local air districts, broad authority over stationary sources, permitting, enforcement, implementation. So all those pieces work together, need to work together with the sort of the three-legged stool to effectively deal with really substantial challenges. So next slide. And I touched on board members. So we have a board of 16 members, and this identifies some changes we went through just this past year, which we had some new board appointees, including a chair in Chair Randolph, who was a former commissioner of the California Public Utilities Commission. And the health and safety code, the law defines the composition of the board. So they come from different air districts. They come from their public appointees. There's a range of expertise, medical, engineering. So there's a geographical representation, an air district representation, an expertise representation, many of which are governor appointees. Two are legislators, ex officio non-voting members of the upper and lower house, and then two legislative appointees focused on environmental justice. So next slide. So I'm going to start when I think about the challenges that the agency faces and some of the progress that we've made, and we'll cover that in a moment. I always think about, first place I look is internal. You know, I'm certainly interested in talking about regulations and incentive programs and partnerships across the United States and internationally, but the most important decisions I make are who I appoint, who I promote, and put positions of leadership. Number one most important decision I make. They have an impact on the tone, the development and mentorship of staff within the organization, the partnering across divisions within the agency, with other agencies, with stakeholders, industry, environmental justice folks, and others. So it is, I can't overstate how important the appointment and promotion of the right people are. And I've always tried to strive to surround myself with stars, and felt pretty good about the folks that we have working at the agency. Next slide. And those are recent appointments, by the way. So, and a focus, we could back up one. And a focus has been I'm sorry, slide 4. A focus has been environmental justice and will be going forward. In other words, if you look at the air quality improvements in the state, now I'll get to this in another slide, so I'm just going to summarize kind of, I think, in some few key factoids that I think are useful to think about. You think about when CARB was established, so basically late 60s, early 70s, and you look at, well, what was let's just give a sort of a snapshot of where California was. California at that time had about a population of about 16 million people, about 8 million vehicles. They were driving about 50 billion miles total VMT. an economy of about 150 billion. And the number of, just using as one metric, stage 1 or stage 2 ozone alerts, basically multiples of the health-based ozone standard in South Coast. And you ask, well, how many times back then were we exceeding those levels that are, extraordinarily unhealthy to everyone, but particularly those that have compromised systems, the young, elderly, and others. 200 times a year plus exceedances of those standards. And you fast forward to today, and we're at about 40 million population in the state, have about 30 million vehicles, if I include trucks, heavy duty trucks, and driving about 370 billion miles. So VMT's going up radically. An economy of about 2.5 trillion increasing, so about the 5th largest in the world. And then you ask the question, well, how about that the ozone levels in South Coast? Now, there's no doubt we still have challenges and have not achieved healthy air quality in South Coast. I need to be really clear on that. But we haven't had a stage 1, and certainly not stage 2, for about 15 years. So the progress is undeniable, and that has come from standards. It's come from engineering, it's come from investments, and certainly investments that industry has made and that consumers cover. But it's incredible in terms of the health dividends that those improvements pay. And it's one of the reasons why people come from around the world to California, really to talk about similar challenges they're facing, whether it's some of our European partners, Mexico, or some other countries. We talk about some of the steps that have been taken and what can be learned. We certainly can learn from them as well, but we discuss this in terms of the opportunities going forward. But with all that said, there are a number of areas around the state, particularly near our most impacted communities, near ports, rail yards, warehouses, where the exposure to diesel particulate matter continues to be vastly higher than the regional average and extraordinarily unhealthful levels. We certainly have made progress, but not near as much as we need to make, and that underscores the focus on environmental justice and equity-focused efforts. Next slide. And one effort internally is really to look at ourselves, kind of where I start, and was similar to the point that I made about appointments. I look at internally, what are the steps that we're taking as an organization? And the fact of the matter is we weren't particularly diverse, and we need to be as diverse and should be as the communities we work with and serve. And it makes us more effective, at doing our job. And there was an entire talent base we weren't tapping into. So we are looking at how can we be more effective in how we recruit, promote, retain, and develop a much more broad-based team. We've established a team internally to help us do that. And we're actually been working through that process and are moving in the right direction on that count. Next slide. So looking back a little bit, this past year was really monumental in terms of regulations and incentives, which we'll talk about a little later. And the way we think about the opportunities and using our authority, first place we always start is look at the emission inventory. Where are the emissions coming from? Think of a pie chart. And then think about where do you need to get to a health-based air quality standards? And where are their greatest opportunities when you look at that emission inventory, different sectors, heavy duty trucks, ocean-going vessels, buses, different size trucks. Where are the emissions coming from, and where are the opportunities to secure those reductions most cost effectively and do it expeditiously? So you're always looking at opportunities, emissions, and opportunities for reductions, and using the rulemaking process to do that. So many of our rules require manufacturers to produce cleaner and cleaner vehicles, including now zero emission vehicles, trucks, cars, and so on. So a percentage of those that they sell into the marketplace need to be progressively zero. And that's really the tools that we use to move forward.
Wait, there's a new link in the
to move forward in terms of both our climate and our air quality targets. But if you think about this, so new trucks, new cars, new buses that are zero emission, they take a while to turn over. In other words, there's the in-use fleet. So that's where incentives often come into play. Can you expedite the turnover? Can you clean the in-use fleet? Can you make it cleaner? So there's always this tension between tighter standards and the in-use fleet, and how do you reduce emissions in the short run? How do you also put us on a trajectory to continue to drive down those emissions? And what's interesting is the actions that California has taken to reduce emissions from trucks, from cars, from a broad range of equipment operating at ports, is actually attracting investment, billions of dollars of investment in California. We now manufacture zero emission buses in California, trucks, forklifts, and obviously we have the largest, from a value standpoint, car zero emission vehicle manufacturer in Tesla. So it is a magnet for investments in terms of the actions and leadership California's taken to take on our air quality and climate challenges. There are economic impacts, benefits that are resulting from that. Next slide. And this illustrates the point that I summed a moment ago in terms of, you just look historically, the undeniable progress in terms of both ozone in South Coast, PM in the Valley, while the economy continued to grow substantially. The number of vehicles grew, the number of gallons of fuel burned, by virtually every metric that you look at. And we know this because we monitor through a few hundred monitors up and down the state, the air quality improvements. But the point that I made before, and I will make again, is it's not time, and we certainly aren't claiming success. There's a lot more to do, a lot more opportunity to build on the success that we've had. And I should note that when I think about that success, and I'm using the metric of air quality, it's been predicated not on, hey, this is a CARB success. It doesn't work that way. It's been a partnership with EPA, with local air districts, industry, environmental groups, back authority. We have considerable authority federally and in the state, and public support. Public demands healthy, clean air quality, receives substantial legislative support and leadership through the board, leadership through elected officials, that air quality and healthy air quality is a priority. Without those elements, we would not have made this progress. At the end of the day, it is results. People expect to see results, and that's something we're proud of, recognizing we still have the challenges in front of us, but we're proud of the progress that's been made, which is substantial. Not fast enough, but it is undeniable in terms of toxics, in terms of ozone, PM 2.5, and so on. Next slide. This just makes the same point with respect to particulate. And again, we have much more to do in the valley, but the progress defined by PM 2.5, for instance, has been substantial in the last several years. Next slide. And toxics. So if I use diesel PM and think about the diesel miles traveled, so the truck travel and truck VMTs actually continued to go up, even during the pandemic. Actually, I think the port activity has actually been up by 40 or 50% over historic levels. I mean, people realize how active Port of LA and Port of Long Beach have been through. Just think about yourself. People are ordering a lot more delivery at home, and those, by and large, those products are coming through the ports and down to a last mile delivery through your Amazon Prime delivery van. But the reduction in diesel cancer risk near the ports, regionally, but certainly near the ports, near the rail yards, has decreased substantially. But the point to note here is the residual risk, the remaining risk, is still unacceptably high, which underscores our need and our focus everywhere possible to phase out of combustion. And we believe there's a path there on the light duty side. We believe there's a path there on the heavy duty side for most applications. Next slide. And GHGs, we have a state law, actually more than one, that underscores the need to drive down GHG emissions, that gave CARB the authority to draft an overall plan for the state and implement many elements of that plan as referenced in our vehicle standards, our low carbon fuel standard, or cap and trade program, and others, as well as other agencies, so cleaning up the energy sector, for instance, that the PUCs and others and CC are involved in, which is continue to pay dividends. So if you think about it, we continue to reduce GHG emissions. We beat our AB 32 target by 4 years, met it in 2016, but then the legislature tightened the target for 2030, which requires a reduction of about 40% below where we are today. And then carbon neutrality, an executive order calling for carbon neutrality by 2045. That's the plan we're working on now. But if you think about this, economies continue to grow, population's going up, our per capita, which is an important metric, continues to be driven down, as well as GHG emissions. But we have a long ways to go to get to carbon neutrality. We're about 425 million metric tons a year right now. Next slide. So the intersection, and this is really what we're looking for in terms of when I think about the key areas that we focus on: traditional air quality, ozone, PM 2.5, PM 10, toxics, diesel PM, hexavalent chromium, perchloroethylene, other chlorinated substances, and climate, GHGs, HFCs, methane. And where there triple play opportunities, where do you get reductions in all three? And generally, not the only case, there are multiple cases, is transportation. Transportation in this California represents about 50% of our GHG emissions, 80% of our NOx, and 95% of our diesel PM. We can transition where it makes sense out of combustion in the transportation sector. We can actually get a triple play in terms of dealing with all three of these elements, which are really important in terms of thinking holistically about the strategies that are put in place. Next slide. But with that said, there's some real challenges going forward. Near-term reductions. We need substantial near-term reductions in South Coast, in the Valley, NOx particularly, and getting those near-term reductions through new regs doesn't really hold, because the whole point that I made, new regs rely on turnover. They rely on an old vehicle, an old truck, for instance, no longer being able to be used, and it's a new purchase. So it takes time for that turnover to play itself out. So traditionally, the near-term reductions are increased enforcement can be a tool. That doesn't always give you near-term reductions. That just may confirm, ensure you're getting what you counted on. But also incentives, incentive dollars to expedite the turnover of older, dirtier cars and trucks. That is a key vehicle. The challenge is there's never enough money. So you have to target those dollars in smart ways that target the oldest, dirtiest, and particularly target the those disadvantaged communities. So that's what we're continuing to focus on. Driving down VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and VMT has traditionally continued to go up in the state for a lot of reasons: housing, affordable housing, but it leads to the increased consumption of fuel. It's one of the reasons why we haven't really seen a significant reduction in our transportation-related GHG emissions, because even though cars are more efficient, they've got heavier because consumer preferences have been shifted to trucks and SUVs, offsetting the efficiency improvements at the same time VMT was going up. So that this is basically offset the GHG benefits that we otherwise would have seen. And most people don't want to spend 2 hours a day in their vehicle. It's about housing and affordability housing. Most people would like to be closer to work. We need to work much more closely with kind of fundamental issues in terms of local land use decision making driven by economics and development. It's a complex issue. It's not a new issue. It's not one that we have limited role, but an important role to work with locals and that the right incentive structures are in place. So a lot more work to do in that space. EV infrastructure. We have a lot of charging stations in California, but we need many, many more, at least 10 times more. And people need to have the confidence that there'll be places, adequate and complete places to charge their cars or trucks and so on. So that is an area we're continuing to work with the utilities, the Public Utilities Commission, and private charging ventures, many of which are establishing charging in California, as well as seeing how we can support through our regulations, handshakes that subsidize or further encourages the utilization and installation utilization of charging stations. Transitioning the in-use fleet, I talked about the challenges on that. Home electrification. Do we continue to use natural gas in homes? What's the future there? Because as you look at the projections in our air quality challenges, reducing the amount of combustion, including natural gas, is going to be progressively more important, particularly in new builds, commercial and residential construction. In use is more challenging. And historical racial injustice and how our strategies and approach methods, regulations, incentives are mindful of those issues and responsive. Next slide. Now I'm going to go through, and I think I'm going to go through the next series a little bit at a little faster clip here. So next slide. So clean transportation, point that I made earlier, you can't achieve healthy air quality, attain our health-based air quality standards, be responsive to toxics, fully responsive to toxic exposure, or meet our GHG targets without the transformation of the transportation sector. It's just not possible if you look at the inventory. And just using one data point, and there's many, many metrics that you could look at. But if you think of the carrying capacity, what would the NOx emissions in South Coast have to be to attain, let's say, the 70 ppb ozone standard, which is a standard that's been adopted. The attainment date's 2037. The carrying capacity, how much NOx on a daily basis are you limited to in South Coast? There's a range, so I'll give you the low end of the range is 55 tons a day of NOx. We're at about 250 today. So think of an 80% reduction from today. So there's no source that you walk away from when you think about reduction. So it's transportation, it's stationary, and a whole range of other sources, area sources, and others in between. Next slide. And the transition to electrification, which our grid is becoming progressively cleaner. Today, even the current grid today, an electric car, truck is far, far cleaner from a NOx and PM standpoint than burning a liquid fuel. That'll only get progressively better as the grid continues to get cleaner and cleaner. And the point that I just made about the transition and attainment of health-based air quality standards and our GHG targets is inescapable. So governor recognized that and issued an executive order calling for the transition of light duty, heavy duty, off-road, a transition, and basically the market's responding. In many cases, there's already a full commercial product. In some cases, they are under development. So particularly heavy duty, it's a complex sector with hundreds of different types of pieces of equipment, but billions and billions being invested. Every major automobile manufacturer has said their future is zero and have committed to 100% zero in the next several years will be their product offerings. And just a few years ago, we had a handful, half dozen zero emission vehicles. Today, we have 50 plus, with those numbers increasing rapidly as the manufacturers invest billions of in both battery technology and different models that they bring to market. Next slide. And next slide. And this just underscores the point that I made. We have tight standards going forward, both in terms of ozone and PM 2.5, and really can't leave any source untouched in terms of thinking about how do we move forward in a smart way, an economic way, providing sufficient lead times and providing health protection that we're all entrusted to provide, and do in a way that works for the state and basically continues to be a model for others to follow through both our partnerships nationally and internationally. Next slide. And near-term needs. We're looking and continue to look where are there opportunities to achieve further reductions in the short run today, because the transition to electrification, as I noted, that takes time for turnover. We think there's more opportunities on locomotives, on heavy duty inspection and maintenance. How do you make sure that those trucks after operating in use are achieving the reductions we count on? If not, can we catch them early and get them fixed? Construction equipment, and just continue to keep our board informed as we turn over these stones and look for the opportunities to deliver further emission reductions and health protection. Next slide. And this is an important point. I mentioned earlier about think of the three baskets of authority: local air districts, and this is, there's exceptions to what I'm saying, so this is an oversimplification, but local air districts, stationary source focused, permitting, enforcement, overall regional air quality management plans they develop in terms of how they're going to attain health-based air quality, and toxics rules and regs. CARB, overall review, approval, transmission of SIPs, state implementation plans to the US EPA, significant role in mobile sources, cars, trucks, whole range of other equipment, boats, jet skis, if it burns weed eaters, if it burns fuels, we certify engines, we regulate them. But with that recognition, US EPA has a role as well for those sources. I refer to them as preempted sources, sources that, the simplified way of thinking about the cross state boundaries. That's an oversimplification, but it's an easy way to think about it. Planes, locomotives, marine vessels. And you can see what this illustrates is as Californians continue to drive emissions down of sources that we have direct authority over, the relative share of emissions owned by the federal preempted sources continue to grow because of the actions and reductions haven't been as fast or as aggressive as they need to be and we'd like them to be. You can see those lines crossing coming up on us in the next few years. The point is much more action needs to take place on locomotives, on aviation, on marine, and we are working with our partners at US EPA, our newfound partnership and the leadership of the EPA to see if that happens. Next slide. And next slide. Community protection is going to continue to be a key driver, certainly in AB 617, but other programs focus on how do we establish stronger working relationships with communities that are responsive. One, hear the concerns, and two, take responsive action in our partnership with air districts, our partnership with our Fed partners, to really, one, understand key issues. We understand many, but not always. Some of them are very community specific, and take actions to, whether it's our enforcement tools, regulatory tools, incentive tools, to be responsive to the concerns and really increase that local partnership. So this is an area that's evolving for us and others to be more effective. And it's an area where we've been working through since AB 617 became law back in 2017. Next slide. And this underscores some of the engagement has resulted in really providing tools for enhanced community empowerment, tools for access, better access to emission inventory data, toxic control technology data, mobile source related assessments, enforcement related. The more information, the more power and the more influence and the more knowledge. That's good for all of us. And we've been learning about how do we translate much of the information that we have into more useful forms that help communities and are listening to communities about how we can better do that, how we can better improve. Next slide. And community sources. I mean, the point that I just made, having a discussion with communities, what are the concerns, what are the issues, and in many cases we have regs in place. How can we improve them, strengthen them, improve enforcement related efforts, and really listen? And that is something we're working through and taking a number of actions through those learnings. Next slide. Next slide. So we have a carbon neutrality target, achievement of carbon neutrality by 2045. So basically the carbon that goes up, that's released, we don't have a net introduction of more carbon in the atmosphere. What that really means to us is we need to continue to drive down emissions of traditional sources, transition out of burning petroleum, reduce HFC, high GWP pollutants, clean up our energy sector. All those things need to continue because there aren't just GHG programs. They're driven by air quality, NOx and PM and toxics. GHGs in a way is a co-benefit of those strategies. Well, we also need to look at where there are opportunities to remove carbon through carbon capture and sequestration, direct air capture, natural working land. So as we update the scoping plan, next slide, we're looking to have a holistic scoping plan. And what that is, the AB 32, the climate bill established in 06, called for CARB to develop an overall plan for the state to achieve its climate targets, looking at the whole scope of sources of emissions and developing strategies to reduce those emissions. That's what we've been doing for several years and why we beat our target that I referred to. It was called out in AB 32, the 2020 target. Now we have a 2030, and I mentioned carbon neutrality. So we're just about to launch the update to the scoping plan, and that scoping plan will be focused on achievement of the AB 32, or rather SB 32 target, which is 40% below where we are today, as well as carbon neutrality by 2045. So it's an exciting process. The ambition is bold, but we really have an opportunity here to continue to drive down emissions and continue to look for opportunities for carbon capture in different forms. Next slide. And next slide. So I touched on this theme, and I really cannot overstate the importance of partnerships, because we cannot be effective without strong partnerships with local air districts, EPA, environmental organizations, environmental justice organizations, industry, academics. It's a big tent, and the challenge is substantial, and the successes and the progress that I pointed to is all predicated on learnings and building on those expertise and those relationships. And that's really what gives me confidence in our ability to continue to deliver achievement of health-based air quality standards, full community protection, we're clearly not there, and achievement of our GHG reduction targets. It's basically built on those precepts, those basic foundation of partnering, good data, good analysis, action, feedback loop, and adjustments over time. Those fundamental principles are as alive today, and I'd say even more so today, given the magnitude of the challenge that we've been historically. So next slide. And this just illustrates our federal partnership, which is one of the key partnerships that we are working with US EPA. And we did over that, by the way, that partnership at the staff level has never been broken. We have worked very closely over the last several years. but the leadership level, that obviously changed with the President Biden team, and are working very closely with the White House team, Gina McCarthy's team, and John Kerry's team. So that work is underway, and they care a lot about what California thinks and want to closely partner with us. So we actually are quite optimistic in building on that partnership. We have a lot to do and are excited about it. Next slide. And this is just a summation of some of what's in the budget. So the budget is broad, it's vast, it has many different elements. But one element I mentioned is incentive dollars. So traditionally, CARB, much of what we do is develop and implement regulations. I mean, we're a regulatory agency, but also we do use the tools of incentives to expedite turnover, to incent early action, and it's been an effective tool for years. This budget includes, there are some other incentive pockets too, but about $1 billion of incentives, and consistent with incentives that we've received past years, the past several years. And the need, although those are big numbers, we don't take them lightly, they are modest relative to the overall need. So they need to be strategically directed, and that's really important. And we've got a lot of public process that we go through to help arrive at those decisions, those recommendations. Next slide. And just a summation. It's a real summation because there's many items over the next year, plus board items that will be going to our board to drive down VOC emissions, drive down NOx, PM, transition to electrification of the transportation sector, everything from Uber and Lyft, which will be transitioning them on any more electric vehicles. The regulation will be advancing later in the next few months. Zero emission transportation refrigeration units, TRUs, onboard diagnostic requirements, hovercraft, heavy duty I&M program, a chrome airborne toxic control measure. So just amongst many other, and small off-road equipment, SOAR, lawnmowers, weed eaters, and so on, and how we're transitioning them to full electrification. Next slide. And we're completing the construction of a Southern California laboratory. So I mentioned CARB's over 50 years old, and sort of our bread and butter has been our motor vehicle testing facility in El Monte for about 50 years. It was designed for about 40 people at the time. We have 400 there now. And that work has been fundamental to improvement of tighter and tighter standards. A car today is 99%, an internal combustion engine is 99% cleaner today than it was back when we were established. But we have a lot more of them and they drive farther, which gets to my point about the transition to electrification. But we're going to be in combustion on heavy duty and a whole range of technologies for a very long time. And we recently completed, or about to complete, Southern California testing facility, really a very unique on light duty, heavy duty, evaporative test, motorcycle. Basically, it burns fuel. We can test it and provide the confidence that it's going to deliver on those emission reductions when it is certified, and in-use testing, which is really important as well. We'll be transitioning that facility in the next few months, and part of it was actually paid with authorization of the legislature from the VW settlement we went through a few years ago. Next slide. And let's just highlight some of the elements of this facility on an 18-acre plot, actually donated by University of Riverside to the state of California, to CARB. And the project, which is nearing its final stage, is really exciting in terms of the history and the organization, and as we move forward taking on challenges. So with that, I think I'm going to end, and again, just extend appreciation for the opportunity to speak with all of you. So that ends my remarks.
Thank you, Rich. I'm looking to see if there's any questions in the chat box. I don't see any, but if you have questions for Rich, please put them in the chat box so we can, direct them to Rich.
Just a quick question, Richard. The Southern California headquarters, is it close to UC Riverside?
It is. It's actually in very close proximity to CSERT and the UC Riverside campus. So we'll be partnering. We have historically partnered with the UC system and the whole, UC system over the entire state. But we'll strengthen that partnership. So that's correct. So we're moving from El Monte to Riverside.
It looks very neat. It reminded me of CSERT. Saw your pictures. Any questions?
Yeah, so we have a question, Bhaskar, and it's about the regulations for the berth and, at berth in the ports. And what's the best way to contact somebody at CARB for guidance and discussion?
There should be contacts on the web. If you hit at berth, they normally have a contact, but if not, you can always, you provide my email, anyone, I can always get it to the right folks, to the folks that oversee the at berth regulation. That would be a Bonnie Soriano that would actually be the manager that oversees that regulation. But one, there's contact information on the web in terms of, if you go to at berth, just hit at berth in the search function and should have a contact that pops up. But if not, certainly you can just point something to me.
Okay, and then there's another question. And this is an interesting one. Does CARB have a social cost factor in greenhouse gas control similar to the Obama era greenhouse gas clean power plan?
Right. So as part of our analysis, if for GHG reduction strategy, so including, just use a scoping plan. That's probably the best place to go. Scoping plan defines what is our statewide GHG emissions, where are we today, what's the standard, for instance, to get to the 2030 target, the SB 32 target. So basically we're at 425 today, we need to get to 260 by 2030, that's the 2030 target. So when we look at that, that analysis looks at different benchmarks, right? It looks at the inventory, where are the emissions coming from? What's BAU? In other words, if you did nothing new, where are you going to be in 2030? Now, there's some elements that you have to look at in terms of economic forecasts and so on. So there's uncertainty boundaries about that estimate. But it's also accounts for the standards we've already adopted. My point is we have tighter vehicle standards. They will roll through the economy. You'll get reductions in some of these sectors. These all have costs, but we do look at, well, and they vary. In other words, some of the programs on a per carbon basis are, in the 2030, some are higher than that. We also, though, look as a benchmark, let's look at what the social cost of carbon would say, and there's different estimates of social cost of carbon, right? It's not a fixed number, but $50, $60 today is about, that's a pretty in the envelope of what EPA and others have put out there. We'll put that benchmark out there, but what we don't do is use it as the standard for all control, because some of our measures actually have a higher cost, some have a lower. If you look at the overall mix, renewable portfolio standard, if you look at it strictly in terms of carbon, that would be higher, quite a bit higher than most estimates of what the social cost of carbon is. Low carbon fuel standards, $210 a metric ton. But the challenge when we try to do a better job of what I'm going to say on this, because when we think about the measures, most of the measures don't exclusively reduce GHG emissions. So what we're trying to also do is not look at the strategies exclusively through a GHG lens, because many are, for instance, low carbon fuel standard is reducing criteria pollutant emissions. Diesel PM, for instance, because renewable diesel may be displacing diesel, or in some cases electrification. So how do you characterize not just the fact that there are GHG benefits, but criteria pollutant and toxic benefits? And then how do you apportion the value of multiple pollutants across one strategy. And there's different ways to do that. So we certainly call out the social cost of carbon and think about it, the measure in the context of cost of carbon today and in the future, but also monetization of those co-benefits, those other pollutants that also factor into this. So it becomes, and this has happened in legislative hearings, you can look at a measure and say, this measure, for instance, is expensive. It's a low carbon fuel standard, $210 metric ton. Point is, well, yes, strictly looked at through that lane, and there's other reasons for it in terms of transitioning out of petroleum. But one thing we underscore is what are those other benefits and how those monetize, and making sure that we are underscoring the range of co-benefits a given measure is producing. So long-winded answers to a really good question, but a complicated question in terms of what the measures actually do.
So we have another question from Capital. We have another question. Krishna, we had a couple before you.
Okay.
Okay, so let me get those two and then we'll get you, Krishna. Other than Tesla, is there encouragement for fast electric charging, and will there be universal payment for charging stations versus the current stovepipe units?
Yeah, there are several manufacturers of charging stations that have DC fast charge stations, right, that are in that space. And it's growing vastly. So think of charging as, you know, level 1, kind of your 110 outlet. Level 2, kind of the 220. And level 3, basically a fast charge type station. So you have several that are in the charging space, either already in the fast charge space or entering that space beyond Tesla, which are unique to Tesla vehicles right now, right? In terms of the adapter. But if you think of the role that ChargePoint and EVgo and Electrify America and a bunch of others that are in this space already for certainly level 2, but are investing significantly in fast charge stations as well. In fact, Electrify America, as part of our settlement with Volkswagen a few years ago, Electrify America was created as a result of that settlement. And part of the settlement was with the Attorney General and the United States Department of Justice, was it created, in addition to penalties, in addition to mitigation, which California got $423 million mitigation, $153 million penalties. Volkswagen created Electrify America, was required to invest in charging stations. They're investing $800 million in charging in California. With all that said, we need a lot more charging, but considerable investment is taking place. As to the model, there's multiple models, and we're not regulating the actual model at this point. There's elements of consumer education we do regulate, but there are different models to meet different consumer demands, and there are variations. And we think there's the need for greater clarity in what consumers pay, to understand what they're actually paying. We certainly regulate the adapters to make sure that a station, certainly one that receives any state funding, it can be used on a whole host of vehicles with respect to the connectors. And we're also looking at ways to how do we support the increased installation of charging stations and create handshakes between our different policies. And one example is low carbon fuel standard. Low carbon fuel standard basically requires older, dirtier fuels, higher carbon intensity fuels, gasoline and diesel, to drive down their carbon intensity. And the way that they do that is they make investments to clean the fuels, or in some cases they buy credits. They buy credits from electrification, cars, for instance, or renewable diesel, biodiesel. My point being that those charging stations generate credits as well. So basically, petroleum subsidizes the transition to electric charging stations by virtue of the rated throughput of those stations. So we are looking for a handshake between the sources contributing most significantly to the emissions, that they are subsidizing the destination of getting out of combustion altogether. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why we get sued and there's opposition from some sectors on that handshake policy.
Can I ask?
Yeah,
Shaheen, can I ask a question?
yeah, go ahead. There is one more question in the chat, but go ahead, Krishna.
Uh, um, we all know that California, of course, is leader. We are trying to reduce the greenhouse effect. And I have a question for the power sector. Most of the power plants which we have in California, which came up after 2001, they are natural gas fired plants. And some of the big utilities are trying to use hydrogen actually for generating power, so the greenhouse gas emissions will go down. But most probably what will happen that the NOx emission, if they are permitted for 2 ppm, probably it will be a difficult job for them to maintain at 2 ppm NOx limit. So are you thinking in those directions that if people are going for using hydrogen, how to handle these NOx emission requirements? Because typically when you reduce greenhouse gas, the criteria pollutant also reduce their co-benefits, but in this case may be higher. So this is becoming a real problem, and a lot of people are discussing, we are discussing outside the box what can be done.
Richard, we lost you, looks like.
Yeah, I just had to reboot on a different computer myself. It looks like we lost him. I don't know if he's going to try and call in. It is 1 o'clock.
But there is one more question in the chat from David Rothbard.
There is, but if Richard's not there, we can't.
Yeah, I think he's coming back.
There he is. He's back up on top.
Hello, Richard. Hello. No.
Okay. I think we have reached 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're not hearing Richard.
Well, hey, it's me. My system, I'm glad I was actually at the end. It dropped me off. So I really obviously didn't want to take that question. So I just bowed out. So, hey, let me give a very short response. I know everyone needs to get back to what they were doing. And it was a good question. But you think about the energy sector, just back up a few years ago, where if you looked at both in-state and then you looked at imported power in the divesting that's taking place with respect to coal, with the increased role that photovoltaics, wind are having, and the progressively cleaner mix. The mix of the energy in California from a carbon standpoint is radically cleaner than it was just a few years ago. And with respect to that, established NOx emissions, no doubt natural gas combined cycle natural gas plants are a significant NOx source. Not seeing a lot of new power plants go in. We're seeing, bottom line, alternatives go in that are backing up that power. And the role of hydrogen, quite a bit of work in that space, both in the transportation and power side, and quite a few refineries looking at the role that recognizing renewable hydrogen may play in their with respect to co-processing. So to me, a lot of opportunity here. No doubt the relative role of power plants in the NOx sector is, I think it's a quarter. So it's going to continue to be important. But as we're seeing the energy mix get progressively cleaner in California, I'm pretty optimistic in terms of the mix. In terms of the legacy fleet, obviously a lot more work to do in that space, particularly the question about hydrogen.
Thanks, Richard. Puneet, do you want to take the last question?
Yeah. I just wanted to thank Richard for presenting today. It was very informative. I know our all of the attendees were happy you were able to give that overview. Thanks to everybody for attending. I would like to encourage everyone to join West Coast Section A&WMA. And you can join our mailing list if you want to know what's going on by just contacting us, and we'll get you on the mailing list. And our next meeting, lunch meeting, will be sometime in May. It'll be Rule 218, the new Rule 218. I think it's 218.1 and 218.1.3,
218.2
which are
and
the new ones.
218.2 and 218.3, which were just adopted last month.
Right. So with that, thank you again, Richard, and we look forward to seeing you at the next meeting.
Good deal.
Have a good
Thanks for having me again. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody, for putting this on.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for joining.
You have a good afternoon.
You too. Thanks.
You too, Joe.
There was one question that we couldn't.
Yeah, we didn't get David, so maybe we can, I lost it, but I have two computers going. I had to turn one off. And maybe you can capture it and we can
Yeah.
send it to Rich, and maybe Rich will give a response.
Yeah,
Just because it was the only question that didn't get answered.
yeah, I'll do that. I think I have David Rothbart's email also. So
Yeah, well, and I have it because I did capture that.
okay,
So I believe that I'll have it when I reboot my computer over here,
okay.
but it just froze on me.
Yeah, I know.
The Mac doesn't do that, but the PC does.
Yeah, we lost you just for a while there.
Yeah, that's why I sent you a quick text on the phone. I don't know if you saw it.
Oh, I'd kept my phone on the silent, so I missed that.
Yeah, I texted you saying, "Hey, I'm gone." So I wanted you to be aware of that.
Okay. No issues. Yeah. Perfect. Turned out good.
Yeah, overall, I think it went well. It was funny because he was talking about some of the things that I was just chatting about with all these new rules, and with CARB being the only one that can do, transportation and mobile sources.
Right. Yeah. Interesting
So
presentation. Okay.
yeah, I think we ended up with my final count was 57.
Okay. Yeah, mine was 55, but yeah.
Well, because a couple jumped off
Okay.
and then others came on. So I was trying to pay attention to that so I knew what was going on. And I will check in a minute here when I hit Word to see if it recaptured all of them, but I believe it would. Recapture, yeah. It auto recovered the document, which has all the addresses. So I'll be able to send that to you, which will have David Rothbart's address on it.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay,
I'll
I'll send it off to you.
yeah.
So I think we're good. I think it